and welcome to our weekly Wednesday webinar with Squibbler. Today, I'm really excited to get to talk to you about writing historical fiction. And this is how you can bring the past to life in your fiction. So we're going to talk about a couple of things. One is how to research effectively, because you will need to do some research depending on the time that you're writing about. We'll take a look at how to create authentic historical characters for your work, and then we'll look at a few common mistakes in historical fiction, and we'll have some tips on how you can avoid making those mistakes. So there is a huge appeal for historical fiction. It's probably one of my favorite genres as well. You do get this sense of escapism when you're reading, and you have depth. You get to essentially time travel to another time or place and experience what people may have experienced living in those different eras. You also get to experience different eras while you're connecting with human emotions and struggles. We tend to still worry about a lot of the same things: love, hate, jealousy. All of these emotions are similar, but people respond to them in different ways in different eras. Historical fiction also satisfies our curiosity about the past, and it provides us a perspective on how people navigated challenges in different times. Where does historical fiction fit in the literary landscape? It also offers context for current social and political issues. I always like to tell my students when I was teaching that if we don't know where we've been, how will we know where we're going? And fiction provides us some guideways for that. Historical fiction also gives voice to previously marginalized perspectives from history, so voices we may not be that familiar with, and it serves as both entertainment and informal education. It also provides us with grounding. It shows us that human nature and core struggles remain consistent across time periods. In the marketplace, in selling your books after you've written them, historical fiction is still a really strong commercial genre, and it has a consistent readership. There's an increased interest in diverse voices and untold stories. So if you're writing something that taps into women's stories, BIPOC experiences, non-Western perspectives, World War II continues to be popular. These are all things that you can tap into that still is something readers are interested in. There's also a growing interest in lesser known historical periods, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So the first thing as you're planning on working on your book is to choose your setting wisely. Writing historical fiction means that your setting is going to be as much of a character as your actual characters will be. So here are a few tips for choosing your period if you have not done this yet. One is your personal connection to your chosen era. Do you like the period you're writing about? If you're writing something and it's not a time period that you're necessarily interested in, you may not end up finishing your book because you'll lose momentum. So it's really important to pick something that you have a natural interest in and that you enjoy reading about. You also want to think about primary and secondary settings. So when are you going to focus on historical events that may be important to your book versus everyday life? Yeah, I do recommend avoiding oversaturated periods unless you have a fresh angle or fresh take on that. There are a lot of books that are on the Greek era, the Roman era, and so forth. The recent book, The Song of Achilles, was unique because it looked at Patroclus' point of view and his relationship with Achilles, which is something that is in the original Iliad but hasn't been explored fully before. Also, one way to test your setting choice is what we call the Goldilocks method. It will help you to test whether or not this setting is a good one. So it shouldn't be something that's too familiar. For example, there are a lot of mysteries set in Victorian England. So if you're going to write in something that's familiar, what are you bringing that's new? It shouldn't be something that's too obscure either. It might confuse readers if there's no way for them to ground themselves in this era that you're writing about. So you want to avoid the too familiar and the too obscure, and you want to get for that nice Goldilocks zone, the just right section. These are periods and eras of time that readers have some awareness of, but they may not know intimately or very well. The Goldilocks method is useful because it's going to help you find periods where you can hook your readers with recognizable historical touchstones. So these are things readers can say, "Oh, I'm familiar with this," and it'll pull them into your story. It'll also surprise your readers with lesser known details and perspectives. You want to avoid having to compete with dozens of similar books, so make sure that you're choosing wisely and that you're bringing something new to the table. You also want to balance your reader accessibility, that they're able to get into this time period you're writing about, with fresh storytelling opportunities. And you also want to tap into accessibility that's going to pull in your readers with curiosity as well. So here are some examples that might be useful. If you're writing about something like World War I, you might talk about the flu pandemic. This is a familiar concept. Most people have heard of this. It's a worldwide phenomenon, but it's a less explored setting. A lot of people write about 1920s Prohibition era. The Great Gatsby is really well known for, a book for this era. So we're familiar with it for pop culture and things we've seen in movies, maybe in some books, but the daily life that people led in this era is less known. So that's something that you can consider as well. You might think about post-World War II recovery periods. We read a lot about World War II. There are endless documentaries, but the aftermath of this era is also extremely important. A lot of us are unfamiliar with rebuilding details. If you need a recommendation, one book that is about post-World War II rebuilding in Berlin is Armageddon, which I recommend. And then you can think of lesser known aspects of familiar periods. So, for example, what was happening in areas of Asia during the American Civil War? Even when we talk about something like the medieval era, that was in a specific space in Europe, right? The medieval era is European. In areas of Asia, it was a golden age. So these are things to consider as well, and maybe places to look to. So once you've selected your setting, you're probably going to want to do some research with it. So there is something to consider here called the research pyramid. I'm going to open this a little bit larger on my screen so you can see it. And of course, it will be available for you to stop during the video and watch. But the first thing to do as you're gathering research is just a historical overview. Look at your general encyclopedias, your textbooks, Wikipedia for basic timelines. Timelines are very useful. You might even save a copy to your files that you can look at to make sure that you're not including things that were not happening in the time period you're writing about. So this is just a good place to start to get your overview. From there, you may want to start looking at period-specific sources. So these can be things like specialized books that are writing about the era, documentaries, and academic articles on the era that you're writing about. Another really fun thing to do is to look at daily life details, social histories, cultural studies, magazines, if it's during the print era, things people were interested in reading about. From there, you can look at primary sources as well. These would be things like letters, diaries, records, government records from that period. And then you can also look to experts. You can get specific details from expert recommendations, from museum archives, and specialized databases. And we'll talk about where you can find these as well as we go through the session. So there are different research sources and types. Primary sources are going to be the first person who has observed something in history. So those will be your letters, your diaries, your newspapers, government records. Secondary sources are those academic works, documentaries, museum resources. It's also useful to find a web page that has period-specific language. And this is around for just about every era. And I wanted to show you just one of these for the Victorian era. So as I was doing the research for this webinar, I'm not writing about the Victorian era, but there is a dictionary from 1909 of Victorian slang that's available online. And it will tell you some of the words and phrases that were popular in the Victorian age. So you can throw some of those in there in your work and make it more realistic for your readers as well. So I would recommend doing a Google search and saving a page like this for yourself. We are going to post on our Discord server this 2-page worksheet packet for you on different research sources that will help you find your resources for your research that you're doing. So if you are not familiar with our Discord server, this is where we have a lot of additional and free material for you. So as soon as we post the webinar, this will give you some places to look as well. The number one tip, even if you don't want to access this worksheet, is make friends with your librarians wherever you are, either at a university or at your local library. They're trained to help you find information quickly, and they're most of them are very happy to help you with finding what you need. So once you're starting your research, you do kind of have to have a plan. Because here's the problem. Once you get started into researching a period of time that you enjoy reading about, you can kind of get lost in the research rabbit hole. So it can be addictive. It's a good idea to keep a research journal separate from your manuscript, but it's just as important to go into your research with purpose and know when to quit. So we'll talk about that as well. So there are some signs that you're over researching. You may have been researching for months, but you have not written a single scene. That means you're spending way too much time on your research when you could start writing. You keep finding one more interesting detail that's delaying your writing, and that detail may not even end up in your writing. You might end up scrapping it. You may be researching topics that are only closely related to your story or tangentially related to your story, but really are not going to move your plot forward. So be careful with that. Another sign is that you feel like you need to be a historical expert before you can write. You don't need to be. You need to focus on your plot and your characters and so forth in your dialogue, but you don't need to be a historical expert on the topic you're writing about. And then the final sign that you may be over researching is that you're avoiding writing because you're afraid you don't know enough yet. That's going to slow you down, and you may not ever end up finishing your project if you don't know that you should be careful with these warning signs. So you don't have to be perfect. You need to get to, again, the Goldilocks stage, the just right, the good enough principle. So you don't need to know everything as you begin writing. You do need to have an understanding of the basic social, political, cultural context of the period. You should have the timeline in your head or somewhere in your notes that you can look at. You don't need to know enough to write authentic dialogue and character behavior for your period. You do need to be aware of this, but dialogue should not sound exactly like it did in the medieval era. You're writing for modern audiences. You do need to know enough to describe daily life, clothing, food, and technology accurately. You wouldn't want to place a technological device that wasn't available in the era unless you're writing science fiction. And you want to make sure that you know enough to avoid major historical anachronisms. I think one of the most famous ones that a lot of people are probably familiar with is that a clock bell rings in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and that's an anachronism. It's out of place. There wouldn't have been a church bell or a clock bell ringing. So you need to make sure you know enough to avoid making mistakes like that. So when are you ready to start writing? You are ready to start writing when you can answer those big picture questions about your setting, the political thinking, the social settings, and so forth. You can also describe to people what some of the characters' social constraints and opportunities might be. In other words, if I were writing a book set in 18th century England about women, I would have to know what their roles were, what they were able to do, what they are not able to do. You're ready to start writing when you have enough sensory details to create atmosphere as well, when you know you can describe a scene well enough that's period accurate. You also know you're ready when you can write a scene without stopping every paragraph to research, which you should never do anyway. You should finish a draft and then go back. You should also know that you're ready to start writing if you have a research system in place where you can ask questions that arise during writing. I like to do this by adding comments for myself in Scribbler. There is a comment section where you can leave notes for yourself. So you can stay on pace with your writing and you won't interrupt your plot and your character, but you can make a quick note, make sure I check this, fact check this, and so forth. Another big tip for our historical writers is to research as you go. So start with about 60 to 70% of what you think you need to know on that research pyramid. And then keep a running list of research questions while you're drafting. You can even use the built-in AI in Scribbler's Ask Scribbler function to find those answers quickly as you're writing. You might use placeholders in your comments that you can leave for yourself in Scribbler. So you could say something like, "What did people in the Victorian age eat for breakfast?" in your draft. You might even think about scheduling regular research breaks in between writing sessions. So you get on a track of doing some research and some writing and some research and some writing. So you're not slowing down your writing process. And remember, you can always go back and fact check and add details in your revision. It doesn't need to be perfect. Your first draft is just that, it's a draft. So, those are some tips for incorporating research and beginning your research. Here are some tips for writing period specific characters. One of the biggest challenges is what's called the mindset challenge. And this is the difficulty we have from authentically portraying how people from different historical periods may have thought, felt, and viewed the world. And this is often very, and radically different from how we feel in the modern age. So, historical characters shouldn't just be modern people in period costumes. They need to have a worldview, assumptions, and mental frameworks of their time to work within. This ties into some common mistakes that people make in writing historical fiction. So, some common mistakes are the idea of modern feminists and corsets. 1850s women typically will not think like a 2020s feminist will. And there are so many constraints on their behavior, how they dress, how they speak, that it's unlikely to make sense for a character to speak the way that modern women would. You wouldn't have something like an atheist medieval peasant. Medieval peasants wouldn't understand that concept. So keep that in mind. You need to think about what the belief system is for your characters. You're not going to have characters in that era that are going to question religion in deeply religious societies. You also want to be careful not to have progressive thinking in regressive times, characters who are way ahead of their time in unrealistic ways. Writers like Jane Eyre, they will write about female characters that do seem out of time, that do seem to speak up, but they still fit within the constraints of their time period. So some ways to do some research for period specific characters is to look at those primary sources, the letters, magazines, how people actually talked about their lives. Research what was considered normal for a time period and what was considered radical thinking for a time period. You can even create sort of a chart for yourself to make sure that your characters stay believable and fit more or less in that framework. You want to understand the information that is available to your characters as well. People living in Shakespeare's age don't have the internet. News is going to travel fairly slowly. How do they get information? How much is available to them? And how reliable is the information they received? That's another question. You might also consider the educational levels and access to different ideas with your characters specific to the time period they're in. And then also remember that social change happens gradually. It's not going to happen through individual enlightenment in most cases. Another tip for period specific characters is make sure that your character's agency, their ability to act, is within historical constraints or makes sense for their characterization and in the time period. There are historical limitations that you need to follow while you can still develop and build on your character strength. You might also consider giving agency to marginalized historical figures. We will have a webinar in 2 weeks on writing about different perspectives from people who have been ignored through a lot of fiction and nonfiction during the course of history. It's also important to avoid the exceptional character trap. This goes with characters in general. You don't want to have a character who's completely perfect, who knows the answers to everything. So when historical fiction writers create protagonists who are unrealistically progressive, enlightened, or ahead of their time, it's kind of difficult for your readers to swallow. So watch for that. So that's with characterization. Here are some tips for writing immersive and credible historical settings. You want to think about using the five senses approach. Oftentimes, as writers, we focus on visual descriptions, but think about what else people think about and read. When I was in grad school, one of my favorite books that I read was a biography of Christopher Marlowe, the famous dramatist who was a contemporary of Shakespeare's. And what I loved about how the writer started this book was that he didn't just start with a description of the settings of London and Cambridge with visual aspects. He talked about the smells of what that would be like in an area that didn't have good sewage, that had butchers that would just let blood go through the streets and so forth. So, if you're stuck thinking about visual things, consider the other the other four senses, sight, smell, taste, sound, touch. And you can also revise your sections using the describe function in Scribbler's AI. Think about daily life details that create immersion. What do people's tables look like? What do they wear? What are some smells that they have around their houses? What are foods that they enjoy that maybe they don't get very often? You might also want to think about technology, customs, and social norms of the period. One thing that I like to do for this is to find illustrated books for children that are around 11 to 12 years old. You can find these used in a lot of cases as well on online bookstores or at your half-price books or wherever your used bookstore is, because these give you images to look at as well as short details. They're like illustrated dictionaries for that period. You might also think about the architecture, clothing, food, and transportation of the time. So another thing that you'll have to consider is balancing your descriptions and your period accuracy with pacing. When are you going to use show versus tell with historical details? The easiest way to do this as you're revising your work, of course, is to use that show and don't tell function that we have in Squibbler. That can help you sort of edit with a focus on limiting unnecessary exposition. You do want to integrate your world building naturally into your narrative. It should, if you have, historical information in there, it shouldn't just be an information dump. It should be there for a historical reason. So there are some historical fiction mistakes to avoid. These are the top 5. One is presentism. That's imposing our modern values on historical characters. One is the museum piece. You've over-researched your project and it's turning into nonfiction and your story gets lost. Your story is what's most important here. Be careful with anachronistic language. You don't want to use modern slang in period dialogue. That may lose your reader. And you don't want to use, this is the opposite. You don't want to use stereotypical portrayals where you're relying on historical cliches. And I've seen writers do this with language as well. Well, they'll have a place set in medieval English called Ye Old So-and-so, Ye Old White Pony or something like that. Try to avoid those historical cliches. You also want to avoid the info dumping. This is very difficult. The first book that I wrote, I was in my early 20s, and I had so much information in my brain about the historical period that I was writing about that I did want to show off what I knew. So there I had lots of passages that had historical information in it that I just felt was important, but it wore down the story. It ultimately didn't help the story at all, and I ended up removing it. So just for fun, if you're looking for a terrific historical novel to read, Squibbler highly recommends James by Percival Everett. This is the 2025 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and it is a historical fiction novel. It's a retelling of Mark Twain's novel, Huckleberry Finn, but it's from the slave Jim's point of view. So it's a great book, highly recommend it. Exclusive to Discord, when this webinar is uploaded, we will include the research sources worksheet for you to help you locate your research effectively. There are a lot of free resources out there, and there are some paid ones that may help you as well. So we did take a look at how to research effectively. You really need to go in with a plan, and you need to know when to stop. We took a look at how to create authentic historical characters, and we looked at some common mistakes to avoid in writing historical fiction. Thank you, as always, for joining us. We love having you with us, and best of luck on your own historical fiction writing journey. Bye, everyone.